It hasn't even been 6 months since the release of the iPhone 16 and 16 Pro lineups, yet there is already quite a bit of information circulating which has to do with Apple's next generation of iPhones. There are numerous supposed changes and new features that presumably the iPhone 17 lineup will bring later this year. From lineup updates to display to camera, there's quite a bit to cover. In this video, we're going to go over what we might know about Apple's next generation of iPhones at this stage. Okay, so first of all, there seems to be much talk about an all-new version of the iPhone for 2025, both specs-wise but also name-wise. This iPhone is set to carry the Air naming, just like the MacBook and the iPad. So you've got the MacBook Air and the iPad Air, and potentially an iPhone Air soon, probably iPhone 17 Air. Now, what does this mean for the entire iPhone lineup in 2025? It seems like the iPhone 17 Air is going to be replacing the Plus model iPhones, the most recent of which obviously being the iPhone 16 Plus. But when it comes to the device itself, the main element of interest about this iPhone 17 Air is its thickness. What is being said so far is that the iPhone 17 Air will be significantly thinner than current iPhones. That could be anywhere between 5 and 6 millimeters, which is a bit thinner than the current iPhone 16 Pro Max, for example. A potential challenge to this is the internal components. It's much easier to work with thinner models when you have more space, as is the case of MacBooks and iPads. But with a unique form factor such as that predicted for the iPhone 17 Air, it's going to be interesting to see how Apple will be able to fit in the parts, especially the battery, which shouldn't be made too much smaller. This is sort of linked to this next point, which has to do with whether the iPhone 17 Air is intended to be a higher-end device that could potentially exceed the Pro models. Now, there seems to be a bit of disagreement in that regard, with prominent analyst Ming-Chi Kuo expressing his doubts. In other words, Ming-Chi Kuo thinks it's unlikely that the iPhone 17 Air will be higher end than the Pro models. I personally agree with this. I think it would be inconsistent for Apple to give the best specs to an iPhone with the Air naming when that hasn't been the case for MacBooks and iPads. Apple seems to be also working on display-related improvements ahead of the release of its next generation of iPhones. These improvements cover areas including refresh rate, durability, and vision. First, it looks like Apple is planning to expand 120Hz refresh rate to the entire iPhone lineup. It's unclear whether this also means that Apple may bring the always-on display functionality beyond the Pro models, but the likely adoption of 120Hz refresh rate across all iPhone models is a welcome addition, since you wouldn't necessarily need to opt for the Pro models if you're looking for a smoother display. Second, it seems like Apple will equip the iPhone 17 lineup with an anti-reflective display that offers more scratch resistance than the ceramic shield that is used for current iPhones. This could be in response to Samsung's implementation of Gorilla Armor 2 in its newly released Galaxy S25 Ultra, which is described as the industry's first scratch-resistant, anti-reflective glass ceramic cover material for mobile devices. This would be a good addition because it makes the display more durable, but also makes it easier to see in lighter environments. Now, Apple are traditionally excellent when it comes to processors. I recently made a video about how Apple processors fare relative to processors from Intel and AMD. Make sure to check it out if you haven't already. But with that being said, the A19 chip is expected to power the iPhone 17 lineup. There was some talk about the A19 being built on a 2nm process, but now it seems like this won't be the case. Instead, the A19 chip will probably receive improvements to its existing 3nm process, which makes it more of an incremental improvement as opposed to something more major. Now, if you're not familiar with this whole nanometer process thing, it's basically about the size of the transistors on the chip. When you have smaller transistors, which is typically what happens when you go from something like a 5nm process to a 3nm process, for example, you will essentially get some benefits out of the chip, mainly greater performance and better power efficiency. Similar to the current iPhones, the iPhone 17 and 17 Air will likely include the standard A19 chip, whereas the A19 Pro chip will be reserved for the Pro models, offering slightly superior performance. Now, where things get interesting is with RAM. It's thought that Apple will be bumping up RAM from 8GB to 12GB. That's 4 more gigs of RAM, which would be a 50% increase in RAM. It's unusual for Apple to increase RAM on iPhones by that much. The most we have seen so far is a 2GB increase from 6GB to 8GB, which is what we have right now. Obviously, 12GB of RAM on an iPhone would be absolutely amazing, as it would improve the ability to handle high workload and would make the iPhone more suitable for working with heavy apps, whether it's one heavy app at a time or whether you need to work with multiple heavy apps. This is especially promising when you also consider that Apple usually does a good job at optimizing RAM management. In other words, Apple has traditionally focused on getting the most out of the RAM that it includes in iPhones, especially when the amount of RAM was much lower in earlier iPhones. Now imagine Apple maintains a similar level of optimization, only this time you actually have significantly more RAM. Surely that's something to keep an eye on. But will 12GB of RAM happen across the entire iPhone 17 lineup? We seem to have different information depending on the source. Analyst Jeff Poo believes that 12GB of RAM will be reserved for the Pro models, whereas Ming-Chi Kuo believes that the 12GB RAM upgrade will only be for the iPhone 17 Pro Max. Now, what Ming-Chi Kuo is suggesting isn't entirely unheard of. In fact, Apple has previously included more RAM on the larger flagship iPhone. If we go back to 2016, for example, we know that Apple included 2GB of RAM in the iPhone 7, but 3GB of RAM in the iPhone 7 Plus. We've also got some improvements to the iPhone camera setup, both front and rear. First of all, it seems like the entire iPhone 17 lineup will be equipped with a 24-megapixel front-facing camera. This would be an upgrade over the current 12-megapixel front-facing camera in the iPhone 16 lineup, allowing for clearer and more detailed photos. Now, in terms of the rear cameras, the iPhone 17 Pro Max is expected to have all three rear cameras at 48 megapixels. This pretty much means increasing the telephoto camera from 12 megapixels to 48 megapixels. The new iPhone 17 Air, on the other hand, is set to have a single lens 48 megapixel rear camera. An interesting potential addition is that at least one iPhone 17 model will feature a mechanical aperture that will allow users to adjust the size of the iPhone's aperture. What that means is that users will be able to change the amount of light reaching the lens depending on whatever environment they're using the camera in. So an example of this would be changing the aperture on the wide lens from f1.8 to something like f2.2, which would mean a smaller aperture, which lets in less light. Okay, now a major area that I wanted to leave till last is the design. What will the iPhone 17 lineup look like? Well, there seems to be significant design changes that might happen. Interestingly enough, it seems like Apple is planning to get rid of the titanium frame and to switch back to aluminium. Along with this, the Pro models may include a half aluminium and half glass back, rather than an all glass back. It's thought that the top half would be made from aluminium, while the bottom half would be made from glass, so that the iPhone can maintain support for wireless charging. Let's focus a bit more on that top half though. It seems like this is where the rear camera setup will be placed. Apple is likely planning to create a slightly larger camera bump with a more rectangular shape, or maybe like an oval sort of shape. This means that we would be moving from a triangular layout to a straight line layout, kind of like what Samsung's been doing with their more recent Galaxy S phones. Now personally, I'm not sure how I feel about this change. I don't think I'm particularly excited for something like this, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to make an uninformed and premature judgment. I'd rather wait to see what the iPhone 17 lineup ends up looking like, and I'd be able to make a much more informed judgment once I actually have the phone in my hands. On a similar note, it has been suggested that the iPhone 17 Pro Max could feature a smaller dynamic island, but Ming-Chi Kuo believes this won't be happening. But what do you think about this? Are you excited for Apple's next generation of iPhones? Do you think those changes and improvements are all realistic? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like, share and subscribe, and feel free to let me know in the comments if there is anything tech that you're interested in and want me to make a video about. In the next video, we're going to explore the history and evolution of Siri. I think it's going to be very interesting, so make sure to tune in for that. Also, please consider supporting me by donating to my channel through buymeacoffee.com. I would really appreciate any support as I continue to bring fun and interesting content like this, only if you can of course. Link is down below. This was the Wizard of Tech, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.